Well, it's new month, new worst to best. And I know that this might not necessarily be the number one band that people were expecting for November, but this is what you're getting. I've been in a real My Chemical Romance mood for the past October. It's kind of my go-to guilty pleasure when it comes to spooky music in that sense, like the Halloween aspect. And yeah, I mean, I got into My Chemical Romance pretty late in the game, if I'm being perfectly honest. I knew about them when I was back in high school and when they got really big when I was in university. I just feel like when they got big, I was getting out of that style of music. Like I was never one to dive into the emo, screamo, very emotional, melodramatic music, which is very interesting because I love the neo-prog sphere, which is exactly that. It's very emotionally charged, very melodramatic, very theatrical. It's essentially proto emo. So yeah, I mean, I didn't get into My Chemical Romance until I guess about 5 years ago, and then I did a deep dive into their musical sphere, and I loved what I was hearing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to rate and talk about my favorite and least favorite My Chemical Romance album. They only really put out 4 studio releases, so I'm just going to be talking about those 4. It's another reason why I'm doing My Chemical Romance, because it's quick. It's easy, and they have officially broken up, so I'm not afraid of running the risk of them putting out a new album, because Gerard Way basically said, no, we're done. That's it. Now, I know that they were planning to tour this past year, but, you know, the world happened, so that put a kibosh on that. Yeah, let's talk about My Chemical Romance. And before we do, few ground rules, these usual ground rules within these worst to best things. First one, biggest one, obviously, this is my own personal, very subjective ranking. I'm not saying that the first one I'm going to be talking about is the absolute worst album that they put out. I'm not saying that the last one I talk about is the absolute best album that they've put out. I'm just saying that if all 4 albums were laid out in front of me, which one would I listen to first? Which one would I listen to last? That's really what it comes down to. Second is that these are just the studio albums. I'm not going to be touching their live albums because they've done some brilliant live stuff, even though sometimes it's a little bit of a mess. I'm only looking at their studio releases. I'm also not looking at any of their, re-releases. I'm not looking at any of their EPs. I'm looking at their studio releases. So I think that's enough preamble. I think that's enough lead up to this really fun band that I'm sure my fan base will just love me talking about. But hey, here we go. Let's start off with, in my opinion, their least best album. Number 4. I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love, released in 2002. All right, their first studio album, the big one that kind of set the stage. This one came out when I was in high school. I remember when it came out, and I didn't really dig it all that much. And even upon subsequent listens, I'm still not a big fan. And I think the biggest weakness of this album is the reliance of the music that was around at that time. I think that the boys were still very young, very green, very new to the game, and they're just not quite comfortable really embracing what would make them very special on their subsequent albums. This still feels very similar to a lot of that punk pop that was going along at that time. So we're looking at like Sum 41, we're looking at Blink 182, we're looking at even Green Day. So a lot of those songs have that pop bubblegum punk feel towards it. It's still very fun, it's still very fresh, but I think the biggest drawback is that they're so green. It's still very raw, but not in a positive light. It's very inexperienced, and you can tell that within a number of these tracks. Now, not everything on this is to be written off. Like, there are still some really, really fun and brilliant tracks off of this. The last one of Demolition Lovers, it's my favorite track off of this album, and it's the longest one, and I just love how heartfelt and how emotional this is. I mean, this is kind of laying the foundation for where the band is going to go within their career, and kind of shows how special this band is going to be. Even with that, we still have some really fun ones. I love Early Sunsets and Over Moroville, the second longest track off of this, and I also love Skylights and Turnstiles. These 2 tracks provides such a really great grounding for the album in showcasing again what the band is going to do and what they're going to say. I also really love Vampires Will Never Hurt You, even though it is basically like a Sum 41 rip-off homage. It still has some really fun aspects. I think Drowning Lessons is kind of their big track off of this album. It's not my favorite. As I mentioned, it does feel like a Sum 41 clone. So this album isn't necessarily a bad album. It's quite a good album. It's just they're still very young. They still have a lot of growing to do. And honestly, I think they just need to find themselves. And this album is not quite ready yet. It's still kind of in the incubation area. But it still shows very promising outlooks. That's what I have to say about I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love. So let's move on to the next one. Number 3. Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge, released in 2004. This was the album that really put them on the map. I distinctly remember when this album came out. It was right at the end of high school for me. I remember this album, American Idiot, a few other ones, System of a Down, their Toxicity album. All of these were like staple of my high school friends. When I was trying to get them to listen to like King Crimson and Genesis and Jethro Tull, they were trying to get me to listen to My Chemical Romance, System of a Down, and Green Day. It kind of worked. I do remember one of my friends getting me to listen to Helena, the first track and the big single off this album, and I found myself really enjoying it. I love more of the operatic and theatrical styles on this. Like, this is where My Chemical Romance was really coming into their own and distancing themselves more from their influences and embracing their more uniqueness in their styles. And this album also has a lot of their bigger tracks. As I mentioned, Helena, To the End, I'm Not Okay, and The Ghost of You. These are all big staple tracks from My Chemical Romance. Like, if you know My Chemical Romance, these are some of the songs that are coming to your mind. The thing is, though, I still feel like this is a little too raw for me. It's a little too punk-induced. It's just a little too sharp. I still think that they're learning. They're still finding themselves. They're still trying to figure out how to distance themselves from some of the punk aspects that I'm not a big fan of, but I know that for many, this is their favorite album from the band, and I can understand why. I love the fact that they're really putting their own stamp on the musical genre, and they're starting to shift and trailblaze what the emo scene is going to be. You know, it's still a really good time, and I still have a lot of fun with it. Like, this album, even though it is dark, it's full of blood, it's full of emo and teenage angst, it still has quite a bit of fun. Like, Hang 'Em High and I Never Told You What I Did for a Living are still extremely fun tracks and really help bring the music to a fun new level. So yeah, that's what I have for Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge. Let's move on to number 2. And I mean, once you find out what number 2 is, you automatically know what number 1 is. So let's just talk about number 2. Number 2.
Killjoys, make some noise.
Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, released in 2010. Holy jeez, I just realized this album was released 10 years ago. Oh, wow. Okay, so, love this album. Love this album. And honestly, it was really hard to figure out which one I loved more, this one or my number 1. And it really went like this. Now, I know a lot of people don't like this album, and I can understand why. It's much more of a pop album than it is a rock album. It's more of like a rock opera in that sense. Like, I love the storyline of this. I love the interludes that we have, like Look Alive, Sunshine, Jetstar, and the Cobra Kid with the traffic report, and then the Good Night, Dr. Death. So I love how this album is structured in having this DJ in this post-apocalyptic, futuristic, dystopian, utopian world, going off on this pirate radio and playing the soundtracks for the Fabulous Killjoys. But, I mean, it also has a number of their more popular hits, like Sing being essentially a pop anthem, like it was covered on Glee. So, you know it's big when they covered it on Glee.
Sing it for the boys, sing it for the girls. Every time that you lose, you sing it for the world. Sing it from the heart.
As well as the second track of Na Na Na, in parentheses, na 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 na. But I also love just the drive and the extreme craziness. Like Scarecrow and Destroya are just balls to the wall insane. I love that even though it's presented in this high polished, high gloss pop outlook, you still have that energetic, raw drive that's found within it. Like, I can't help but dance around when Na 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 comes on. And Sing, I mean, all joking aside, is still a very heartfelt anthem of coming into your own and not letting anybody else dictate who you are. And I mean, it still has that heartfelt, like the Kids from Yesterday is extremely heartfelt and very kind of looking to the past and being like, yeah, we tried and we kind of failed, so now what? Yeah, and I love the ebb and flow of the story. I really, really do. Vampire Money is just a fun homage to the kind of like 50s swing. Honestly, it's a good time. That's what it really comes down to. At the end of the day, it's a good time. I love listening to this. I probably listen to this album the most just for how spinnable it is and how much of a repeated listen it is. So yeah, I have a great time with Danger Days. But yeah, that's really all I have to say about it. So with that, let's move on to the number 1 album from My Chemical Romance. Number 1. The Black Parade, released in 2006. So, coming off the heels of 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, The Black Parade came and hit hard. This one I loved. Like, this was the first album from My Chemical Romance that I really, really got into. I had heard 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, didn't really connect with me all that well. But when I listened to The Black Parade, I got hooked right from the beginning with the opening track of The End, the next track of Dead. Both of those tracks was just a 1-2 punch that hooked, line, and sunk me right into it. There's also, of course, the title track of Welcome to the Black Parade, which we all know, it's a meme by this point. But honestly, I think my favorite track off this album is Sleep. I love how heartfelt it is. I love how emotional it is. I love how right at the beginning of the track, it sounds like this tape recording that's kind of skipping a whole lot. You know, basically talking about this person that's terrified to go to sleep because he's talking about these terrors. It feels like somebody's gripping his throat within this like sleep paralysis, this night terrors. Like, where does death begin and sleep end? So that's terrifying. And I also love how there's this giant buildup for this. Like, I love the build-up and the big crescendo at the end. Such a great, great piece, and I really love that. And I also love how it's kind of sandwiched between these 2 more fun tracks of Mama and Teenagers. And honestly, each of the songs on here are stellar. Like, even some of the smaller ones and the ones that don't hit me quite as hard, like the Sharpest Lives, Cancer, and Disenchanted might not necessarily be my favorite tracks, but I still really, really love them. Like, I love how personal and lamenting Disenchanted is, with just being a guitar. Like, this is something that I don't think would fit very well within the first 2 albums, but fits perfectly on this one. I also love Famous Last Words, the final track off of this, of being just I'm not going to give up, even though this is the end. I'm still going to keep fighting, and it's really the big anthem of this album. And I mean, I love the hidden track of Blood. It's just a fun track, especially for those emo kids out there. And I mean, it does still have those staple emo tracks of I Don't Love You. Even though it is this big lamenting, this big angsty outpour, it's still fun. And that's one thing that I do appreciate from this subgenre that I think a lot of bands that embrace the emo style kind of forgot. Now, there are outliers, but for the most part, that's kind of what separates the good emo bands from the blah emo bands. But yeah, that's kind of my list. That's my list of my favorite My Chemical Romance albums, from worst to best. What did you guys think? Where does your love for this band fall? Which ones are your favorite albums? Which ones are your least favorite albums? Let me know all about that by commenting down below. If you haven't followed me on social media, check me out. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's all good stuff. Also, check out my podcast, Quid Prog Quo. Maybe in the future I'll get one of my more proggy friends to listen to My Chemical Romance, because I'm struggling when I'm getting those individuals on. Anyway, that's about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.